We are going into week 10 of our series, Trial and Triumph. And I'm going to invite you to open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 9. We're going to have a second go at that. The first part of the passage tells us of the deep reflection of Daniel. We learn about his intercession, his confession, his petition, as he comes to a realization that prophets such as Jeremiah are now proving to be right. But then the passage takes a really interesting turn, and we're going to read it together now, and it's only 7 verses, and then we're going to take some time to work through it in an interesting way here. Let's just read the passage here. While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people, Israel, and making my request to the Lord my God for his holy hill, while I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I had seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice. He instructed me and said to me, Daniel, I have now come to give you insight and understanding. As soon as you began to pray, a word went out, which I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. 70 sevens are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation, until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. This is widely understood to be a difficult passage to work with. Scholars call it the hardest part of Daniel to interpret. Indeed, one of the hardest parts of the Old Testament to interpret. So we are going into deep water together today. There are some key things we need to know as we consider this. First, this is a section that fits into a genre called apocalyptic writing. And I've talked about this in our Old Testament prophets series, but I'm going to offer a few reminders out of that again here. Apocalyptic writing usually appears in the midst of crises among people, and it offers tangible hope in times where God's story seems unclear in their immediate context. And then, in this case, one period, the 70 years of exile, is clearly ending for Israel, and all of a sudden it looks like Jeremiah's words have been fulfilled. So now, what is next isn't all that clear. It is not always 100% literal. We can agree that some of it is symbolic or even allegorical. But at the same time, it is also mysteriously tangible at some level. Nothing is nothing. The next steps for Israel are in this writing, even if you need to sift through some symbolism in order to understand it. It is as much or even more concerned with the time it is written than the far distant future. All right, we often take apocalyptic writing and begin to really sort of look to surmise how the end time is going to be. We use it to look at future tribulations and rapture theories and different things like that. But the historic and social context of the time does influence how things are interpreted. All right, Israel needs answers for their immediate future. Daniel is praying for their immediate future. He's not praying about how the end of time is going to play out. He needs hope now. But with all that said, it does kind of play out across 2 axes, if you think of it like a graph. There is one axis that looks to the present and one that looks to the end, and it can kind of look like this. Immediate context, distant future. Now, if it is all about focusing on the distant future and all the end, then the people to whom it is being written somehow don't matter. They're just tools and nothing more. If it is all about the immediate context, then the big story of God gets downplayed. For me, if you're going to err on one side or the other, my suggestion is to lean more towards the immediate audience, lean into mystery, not conspiracy, and then don't try to have it all worked out for the future. Understand that there is a context that this is being written to. But also understand that in Daniel's case, the wording indicates that something is on the horizon for Israel that will actually have long-term effect. It's going to have long-term effect in this case, indeed for the whole world. And from chapter 10 onwards, these things begin to get fleshed out. So these are some of the parameters to understand apocalyptic literature that we work with. We now have a bit of a journey to go on here. 490 years. Some translations use a period of 70 weeks to describe this, but the better translation is actually what the NIV captures here, 77s. We know from Israel's history that any section of 70 literal weeks from Daniel's vision until Jesus won't amount to anything as lofty as what those so there's no, 70 weeks won't have accomplished much. But 77s can accomplish so much more. So the 77s are also universally regarded as 7-year blocks, and so we have called this a stated period of 490 years. But if we take this as a literal 490 years, we end up in a bit of a no man's land when it comes to human and even religious history. For example, so I'm just going to stop here. Let me go back to this image here. Who remembers playing Battleship as a kid? The idea is you don't know where everybody else has laid something out on the other side, right? You've got this board, you've got your little grid of where you've got all your ships, and there's a board, you can't see the other player. But then you're throwing coordinates out. And someone's going to go on the other side, yep, that's a hit, or nope, that's a miss. And you're kind of like lobbing things over the top, hoping something's going to hit. And sometimes reading timelines or trying to really make perfect sense of apocalyptic literature is a bit like that. We kind of lob stones over this wall to try to hit something, and we don't know if we're hitting or missing. Did I get the big long submarine, or did I miss that little thing in there, or has it just gone straight into the water? That's what's going on here. We could lob a few stones, okay, and we could start with the Edict of Cyrus. That's the time where Cyrus said, okay, go build the temple in 537 BC. And if we add 490 years, we end up at 47 BC. Now, in that year, there was a bit of conflict between Herod the Great and the Jewish Sanhedrin, the 70 wise people of the Jewish law. But there was nothing all that crazy or chaotic or what you might call apocalyptic going on. The 490 years could begin at, say, 515. The temple had been reconstructed and is dedicated that year. But then that lands us in 25 BC, and Herod the Great is still there and it's business as usual. It could begin with the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. And we may get something more interesting with that. The call to build the actual city of Jerusalem took place in roughly 450 BC. Okay, because bear in mind the temple is rebuilt previously, but the actual call to rebuild Jerusalem could fit there. And this will take us to 40 AD. Jesus, the anointed one, has been and gone. The church age is definitely up and running by then. But if this anointed one is cut off in the 62nd week, then we still have more significant events to come at this point. So 40 AD actually is probably too early to call this passage complete. There is also a significant wrinkle in Judah's history that does make some scholars sit up and take notice. There was a time where a group of people called the Seleucids reigned over the region of Palestine. This was a breakaway group that emerged out of the Greek Empire after the death of Alexander the Great. This will be what will be later pointed to as the King of the North. In 168 BC, their king, Antiochus IV, decided to persecute Jewish worship in an attempt to fully Hellenize the nation, to make them a more Greek nation, not a Jewish one. He ceased proper temple practice. He put out the flame that was never to be put out in the temple. He sacrificed pigs on the altar of the Lord and forced the priests to eat its flesh. The Maccabean revolt emerged out of that, and this led to the temple being restored again in 164 BC. With this major event happening and an apparent abomination in the temple wing accompanying it, a number of scholars offer a timeline that begins with the first group of exiles in Jeremiah's call to rebuild Jerusalem and ends with the events of this particular thing. And this is actually called the Antiochene interpretation. For me, that's a little bit too much like this. Has an immediate effect, but nowhere near accomplishes the grand things that this vision says is going to happen. I want to offer another idea that actually I feel more comfortable with, and I think it actually captures what the New Testament writers want to convey as well. I'm drawn to what is called the symbolic messianic view. The context of chapter 9 is all about sevens and Sabbaths and Levitical covenantal ideas. The Hebrew use of the number 7 can point to things brought to completion. That is definitely the idea with the exile lasting 70 years. 10 Sabbath years worth of exile for the land to rest from Israel's injustice. And 70 years of exile now making way for 70 times 7 worth of years. If you look at Jesus speaking about forgiveness, he speaks of doing this, 70 times 7. To say that, okay, if someone hurts you the 491st time, have at it? No. To say, forgive as completely as you can. Because God forgives us completely. The idea of an abomination that is mentioned in the holy place is mentioned as still to come by Jesus in Matthew 24. The context indicates it will be Judea-centric, and the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in AD 70 makes good sense for the fulfillment of this verse. So for me, I am actually very comfortable with a time frame of a symbolic 490 years. It's a symbolic period of time which will complete a number of key objectives that God is still wanting to do through the nation. A period of time that has been ordained, which will to some degree complete the role of Jerusalem's redemptive work in the role in the world. For me, I think this is actually an ordained 490 years set up in a symbolic way that fits with Judah's second temple period of history. Commencing anywhere from 537 BC onwards, depending on the scholar you consult, and being fully or mostly complete by 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. Some also extend it in a more futuristic perspective to include the church age. That in that thinking, we are kind of like in the 70th week, as it were. But most concur that the completeness of this time leaves the world looking to Christ's ultimate return and the renewal of all things. But this doesn't mean the events in the meantime are nothing, and my PowerPoint isn't really fitting here. Thank you, Apple. Apple and Microsoft not talking to each other. The rising up of the Greek Empire and its splitting off is pointed to in Daniel. The dream statue of chapter 2 indicates this. The broken toes breaking off, that sort of stuff actually points to the breaking down of the Greek Empire. The kings of the north and the south are the result of that splintering. They are both Hellenized groups that that are bringing in the Greek way of life. And there's a group that rules over Egypt. There's a group that rules over Syria and southern Turkey and out to roughly Uzbekistan. And Israel will be caught in the middle of these things, and the land will be coveted by both. It was prime real estate for the trade routes of the region. The time of Antiochus and the atrocities appear to fit with some of Daniel's visions and are perhaps even partially fulfilled here. But these events may better serve as patterns for things which will continue until Christ returns and human history as we currently know it ends. The pattern of an abomination occurs in 167 BC with Antiochus sacrificing pigs in the temple. It's a pattern. It's a type. The fulfillment of Christ's abomination, the one he actually says will occur, let the reader read and understand, is what he says. That one probably occurs in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple and the Romans pushing down the walls with their bare hands and going into the most holy place. But the pattern will continue, with Daniel being given the word desolation in plural. Desolations have been decreed. A man of lawlessness is pointed to in 2 Thessalonians 2. A beast-like figure will seek to be worshipped by the whole world in Revelation 13. But in those passages, a dilemma emerges. Will a third temple be rebuilt for these things to occur? Or will apostasy in the present day spiritual temple be the harbour from which this falsehood would come? I personally don't believe a third temple will ever be built. And I think this would actually make a mockery of all those who have lived watchful lives from Christ's ascension till now. So all of that hopefully helps us understand the depth of what we're reading here and how many possible ways you could actually try to interpret this. And so many good, godly, Christ-honouring people have come up with so many different conclusions on this. It is a deep thing. The language is hard to understand. It is a really challenging passage to get our head around. For me, the symbolic messianic view fits best. But we are also about to come around the communion table. And even at home, I would love for you to join with us, and maybe you want to send one of your kids or send someone to raid the pantry and get some bread and some juice so you can join us in a moment. And I believe the 6 aims of this ordained prophetic time lead us without hesitation to this table. If you're lost in all that timeline stuff, that's perfectly fine. It's hard. It's like swimming through treacle. But definitely lean into this next bit. Because my belief is that only the work of Christ can do what these things seek to do. Let me draw your attention to verse 24. For me, the centerpiece of this. Consider the word and understand the vision. 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city to finish transgression. Listen to that. To finish transgression. to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Remember here that Daniel is praying a specific prayer that precedes this. I'll paraphrase it. He says, Lord God, we have sinned greatly. We are in exile rightly because of it. But we ask that you turn away your anger and wrath to look at us again with favour, to extend mercy and grace towards us. The message in response is, yes, God is going to do all of that in a more complete way than you may realise, Daniel. To finish transgression, to end sin. These are things that only God can do. Am I right? Only God can do this. So God is going to take matters into his own hands. To make sin come to an end is only something God can do. And that leads us to the third one, to atone for wickedness. This is a human action that yields God's forgiveness. In Leviticus 5:10, the priest makes the burnt offering and makes atonement. Then the offender is forgiven. That's the wording of Leviticus. In Hebrews 9:14, Jesus offers himself as an unblemished sacrifice. In 1 John 2:2, we're told that Jesus is the atoning sacrifice for our sins and that of the world. Through Christ, God accomplishes all those first three things. He puts an end to sin through the work of the cross. He brings, our sin is atoned for. Our forgiveness, our justification comes about this. Our sin is no longer held against us as an offense before God. God puts an end to sin through the work of Christ. And an everlasting righteousness is the result. One scholar actually said that theologically, this phrase is a short leap to the New Testament idea of justification by faith. Righteousness is an attribute of God alone. But we are given this amazing image of Christ's work in 2 Corinthians 5. We're going to sing about this shortly. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. It's not just a granting, it's a becoming. Bringing in everlasting righteousness is something that you and I sit under in grace. To seal up vision and prophecy is an interesting phrase, and we're not 100% certain on this. It can refer to authentication. It can talk about completion. It may well indicate an end to written revelation. Everything except for perhaps Revelation had been well and truly written by 70 AD. And in the apocalyptic work of Revelation, we actually see a scroll of 7 seals being cracked open by the risen and glorified Christ. And there is this last one, to anoint the most holy place. Well, Jesus didn't anoint a most holy place. He kind of turned the tables in it and brought judgment on it. This could be the temple of God coming down among man in the future age. The temple was anointed in rededication in 515 BC, but that's not the completion of this. It was rededicated again in 164 BC after driving out the Seleucids. It no longer stood after 70 AD and likely won't ever again. But there is action going on in the temple proper. Remember that the temple, the tabernacle, all of these things were a grey-lead sketch, a shadow of what was actually done in heaven. It was a rough draft of what God's throne room is like. Hebrews points us to Jesus interceding for us with his blood in the actual most holy place, the place where the Father sits on his throne. The only temple talk that is offered to the New Testament church is first the temple of Christ's body being offered for us, and the figurative temple of Christ's body standing as the church. Many who hold the symbolic view actually see the church as a partial fulfillment of this also. And in the end, all of these factors, no matter how we interpret them in the here and now, will most certainly be completely fulfilled in eternity. The Spirit residing in us now is a down payment, a deposit, a pledge to tell us that full salvation is still to come. So we're going to come now to a time of eating and drinking at the Lord's table together. I spoke briefly about this last week as we looked at 1 Corinthians, and this is a sacred space. This is something that we don't do in any form of contempt, and we must do this with self-examination and allowing the Spirit to speak to us, to allow ourselves to come in a worthy manner before the Lord together. We remember again that Christ died. And in this monthly moment, we are proclaiming his death until he comes yet again. And we can do that this time with this unique perspective in mind. Thanks to the work of Daniel. Our sin is forgiven, and all sin will end through Christ. Our righteousness is found in faith because Jesus made atonement for us. And this will be our full reality in the time to come. All prophecy and vision and revelation will make perfect sense in that day, and all timelines and all surmising will no longer be necessary. We will dwell with God forever. We will behold him with our own eyes as he sits on his most holy throne. So as we come together, we are proclaiming his death until he comes. We remember the work of Christ that has accomplished great things. But we also remember he is coming and he will complete what he started. And no matter how we want to work out these 70 weeks, give or take, or this and that, it ultimately doesn't matter. God knows the timeline better than we do. And he will finish what he starts. So we will proclaim his death together through the eating of the bread, through the drinking of the cup. But we do this with anticipation. We will keep doing this every month until he comes. And we do this looking forward to his coming.